Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I suppose we have some ladies. I hope, as we have a quite handsome guest today with us. So, to welcome to enter the Matrix series, where we talk with captains from different WTC teams to actually show how they approach the event. And today we have with us Liam Hackett, who, from what I know, you just took over the role as a captain from Eric. And we have Jeremy as my co-host once again because actually your time zone is way better than Anthony's. So
I'm in
thank
the
you.
same time zone as Anthony. He
Never
has no
mind.
excuse.
Never. Okay. Well, fair enough. Thank you for your hard work then. So Liam, how are you doing? I know it's very early for you.
No, I'm doing really, really good. And to anybody listening or watching, I apologize if at any point you hear me drinking my coffee or eating my breakfast.
So it's quite a change of scenery because when usually we have somebody sitting in a dark room, today Liam, when we actually joined the call, was ordering his coffee at the McDonald's, and he's joining us on his phone from his car. So you can see that he's dedicated to actually be a
I, I,
part of.
I do apologize if the quality's a little bit lower, but man's got to eat and a man's got to work.
No, we
No,
appreciate you taking the time, Liam. Looking forward to this conversation.
yeah. So how come you got the role of a captain after last year?
So Eric and I worked really, really closely together for the 2022 team. We live very close together, so he and I have kind of been partners in crime for a little while there when it comes to the WTC. But I think that, especially for the Australian, like being realistic, it's a $5,000-6,000 Australian trip to come to the WTC. It's an immense investment in not just time but money as well. And the reality is that almost nobody can consistently go to the WTC every single year. There will need to be a bit of diversity in who goes and when they go. Eric himself put his heart and soul into the 2022 World Championship win. And I think after that, anybody would be exhausted, anybody would be tired. And because of the mission achieved, the objective box ticks, the to-do list completed, I think Eric needed a little bit of a break. I'm a glutton. I'm an absolute addict to Warhammer 40k. I cannot get enough. And so I was ready and willing to go back. I think on the flight home, I already committed to going again. And also just for the record, it's a 30.5-hour round trip to get to the WTC as well from Brisbane, Australia, where Eric and I live. So, in the middle of a 30-hour commute back home, I was like, yeah, I'd love to do this again. This would be awesome. And I think in that context, Eric and I had a lot of good chats about who would be good to fill the role. And I'm very, very privileged to be doing this again for Australia.
Okay, so in your case, it was your first event. Do I recall it correctly? I think it was your first WTC.
It's actually my second. I went to the Serbia one, I believe, in 2019. That was my first event out of Australia ever, and only my second or third team event on a significant scale. At that point, I was pretty junior, green to playing 40k on a competitive level.
And in 2019, your team actually did fairly well, didn't they?
Yeah, I'm pretty proud of how we did. From memory, we came fourth, but in my own defense, I can't remember what happened last week, let alone what happened in 2019, considering we've had a pandemic between now and then. But I believe we came fourth, and I was pretty proud of how a lot of Aussies did in the singles, both like myself and Matthew Morozoli as well at that event. And I was super pumped up to come back in 2020, but we know what happened there. And then I was even more pumped in 2021, but we know what happened there. And so 2022 was like a lot of adrenaline energy channeled over about 3 years, pumped into one event.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I think we had the same feeling in Poland with like basically 3 years of prep coming into one event. So I get that. And you mentioned quite early, and that's something that one of the previous captains wanted to touch upon. You mentioned that this event is quite expensive for you, which is completely understandable. So, how do you guys have any way of financing yourselves? Do you have sponsors, or is it fully out of your own pocket?
So we do have some sponsors and we do some fundraising, but realistically, Australia being a smaller country and also not being culturally as well, sometimes it can be challenging to raise money for a premier team to go back and try and win a gaming event. Were we amazing athletes and football stars, not saying that some of us aren't premier athletes, some of us are sprinters by trade, Matt, but it would be easier for us to raise some money. This year, we've approached it a little bit differently. I think because we did win the 2022 WTC, it has helped us in some ways get the ball rolling for fundraising for the next year, because we can say, like, look, guys, we can do it. We know we can do it. Support us to go back and try and do it again. But no matter how I sugarcoat it or tiptoe around the issue, it is very expensive for the players. And I do not foresee a world where every person you see at the WTC has committed $5,000 to be there, even with fundraising.
Yeah, that's insane. And this, I think, clearly transitions into one of the questions, which is, how do you guys approach choosing a team? Because I imagine the money must be a huge factor. That must be something you just touch upon at the very beginning and tell the players, like, yo, guys, you need to have that much money to be able to go. But obviously, like last year, I know you had basically 1 week off just to play, where you gathered to actually get some games in. So there's a lot of commitment coming in. So what's your guys' approach like, especially you as a new captain? What you are looking for players, and how do you want to do it?
So how we approach player selection is kind of, I think the best way to summarize it is actually what we put on the application form for new players, kind of sort of summarizes it well. In the application form, it's reasonably long when we ask them to fill it out, but it's got a disclaimer on it. And the disclaimer kind of explains that, I understand that by applying to the Australian team, I am committing to paying potentially X amount of dollars, and I'm committing to putting in potentially hundreds, if not thousands of hours over the course of, 6 to 8 months, completely in this team dynamic in of itself. And we make that really transparently clear, because quite a lot of the players, for example, like myself, have really only been involved in the WTC for a couple of years. And I think the WTC is a combination for Australians of a chance to step up and a chance to get better, but also it is that huge financial and time commitment that a lot of hobbyists, even competitive players, may not be ready to commit to. So first and foremost, I don't mind if we have to gloss over, for example, the creme de la creme of the 40K players in Australia, if those players are not committed to putting in that time, that money, and that effort. What I would much rather is, for argument's sake, take people who are further down the tier list, but who are willing to give it 110%, because they're the people who are going to skill up. They're the people who will research the meta, and they're the people that in a team environment I know will be much more invaluable than somebody who's an individual champion. I've heard Team Australia's coach from this outgoing year, Denise, who you would have seen walking around at the event. Denise he's played some competitive Taekwondo, and from that, he's always said the phrase, I would much rather take a championship team rather than a team of champions. And I agree with that really wholeheartedly. I think that's a really good adage to sort of run the team by. From me as the captain, the third thing that I kind of look at, so sort of like that commitment, both to time and to money, obviously player skill, but very, very close, perhaps equally to all of these things, is going to be a culture fit. I've touched on a couple of times how committed the Aussies got to be. I mean, we fly 30 and a half hours to be there. We rock up not having slept for a day and a half, having, basically slept on the floor of Singapore airport, eaten some of those really bizarre dried meats that they sell. God, they're delicious though. They're really good. Anyway, but the thing is that if you're spending that much time with a group of guys, I'm not going to travel and I'm not going to compete. I'm not going to try and take on the world with a group of guys I don't get along with. And as much as that's not me saying at all that I'm going to pick my friends. I'm saying that the team has to gel together. They have to have a similar attitude of Aussies like to banter. Aussies like to talk smack. But Aussies also like to just fool around and have a good time on a traveling trip. And so when I am looking at players and when I'm looking at coaches, there is a world where you pick people who may not immediately seem to be optimal, because I know that when push comes to shove and we're playing Poland at the end and I'm getting even balder every minute that round goes on because of the stress level, that those particular players are going to be the people who keep us going. That's kind of how I think attitude is so important to the event.
And I fully agree with this. Like, we have the privilege of actually being able to not having that barrier of $5,000-$6,000, which is great because we don't have that kind of money in Poland. But how do you guys wanna approach like choosing the team? Because you said that it's like 6-8 months plan, thousands, hundreds of hours. So how do you guys do it? From what I remember, you guys have kind of similar approach as we do. You play a lot of WTC formats, basically differential systems, a lot of team events. That's how you guys prepare. But can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, happy to. So we obviously play a lot of WTC events. So we obviously have ITC rankings here in Australia that have definitely become a lot more robust and more realistic to look at. We have more events now than we've ever had. And so as the captain, I have more data now than I would ever have in any previous year, which I'm really happy about. The main way that I approach WTC is kind of looking at players individually. So I've obviously spent a bit of time talking to other teams, and I know, for example, the French team has a truly monumental process to pick their captain, which, from my perspective, is more complicated than the WTC itself. I think that selection process is a full mission on its own. But for Australia, even though I think the pool of players are exceptionally good, the realistic nature is the pool of players is smaller. And so our selection process is more individualized and probably more subjective. And by that I mean, as the captain, I'm very privileged to have some returning players from the outgoing championship team. But the selection process is, once people apply, I'm looking at them individually. Mm-hmm. There is not really as much of an objective process as other teams. I'm looking at people individually based on the things that I've already told you about, based on their attitude, based on how committed I know them to be. And there are some really harsh parts to this selection, because at the end of the day, because it is subjective, there are things I can look at that maybe other teams can't. For example, we have some good players who have applied, but they're going through some extremely tough parts in their life where, some of them might be in the military and they've just been deployed somewhere, for example. And even though they might be very, very good players, if I say, hey, every Saturday we're playing 10 hours.
And he's back. Don't worry, Liam. We won't embarrass you. We'll just cut you out entirely.
I've just done some shuttle sprints to get to the work computer.
We appreciate it.
Ready to go.
All right, where were we? Typhus, you had made a note?
Yeah. So, welcome back after a short interruption. As you can tell, the vistas have changed a little bit. We are no longer in a car, now we are in a cubicle. So I don't know if we are advanced, but coming back to the topic, as we can hear Liam's heavy breathing after a run. You said that you demand a lot of work from players. And obviously you mean by hours, and you mentioned something about playing on Saturdays. How do you guys handle being spread out? Because Australia, you have basically few centers of civilization within your country, and then vast nothingness. And I assume no 40k players play in the Midlands, but how do you guys handle it, and what do you want from your players?
No, there isn't really an Ayers Rock GT. So no, you're right. The middle of Australia doesn't see much play. So we're pretty spread out, but equally we are clustered together. So you made the comment about there being centers of civilization. That's kind of around what 40k here in Australia centers around. So we've got the East Coast and sort of the West Coast and Southern Australia. It's kind of like three sort of clusters together. For example, along the East Coast, I live in a state called Queensland, and here from WTC, I live in this city, Eric lives in this city, Simon lives in this city, Hayden Warlock lives in this city, and I guarantee you for the returning team, there'll be a reasonable chunk of the team from my city alone, so within 20 minutes drive of where I live. Down a little bit further south, you have Victoria, and that's where names like Matthew Morozoli, Jeremy Martino, and Matt Jackson, who came to the WTC this year, that's where they all live, in Melbourne. So you can already see from that a reasonable percentage of the WTC team, though we're split, 10-hour drive apart or a 3-hour or a couple-hour flight, we are clustered together, so we can do all that practice. The other thing, which I'm sure is not unique to us, is just how active our team chats are. So the chat, when it gets a bit more serious and isn't just entirely filled with memes, does sort of always flow. It's always evolving and it's always working on ideas. And even though I understand, people can't be on their phone all day, one of the things I absolutely will not negotiate on is if people are involved in the team, they have to be involved in the chat, always monitoring, always looking at new ideas, always being up to date. Because the moment we fall behind, in my mind, is the moment we lose.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and with the whole preparation and chat, you basically also mean like people sharing knowledge, right? That's what I think TTS was for us. Just a way to share knowledge with higher, like better players playing with each other, just to show the games to newer players so they can get familiar with the tricks, with how we think, etc., etc. And we also try to never hold back our own ideas within our community so everyone can learn. And I assume you also mean the same.
I mean the same, but even taking it one step further, when I talk about commitment in time hours, the sort of the third sphere of commitment is understanding that the WTC is the biggest thing that the Aussies are going to go play in a year, and putting that on the pedestal I think it deserves. One of the things that's undeniable is that when you get used to playing teams 40k, everyone still plays singles events. And one thing that I fully expect is, even when you go play singles events, you should be playing the faction that you're taking to WTC. I don't expect you to take the list that you're taking, but I expect you to use singles events as practice. I expect you to use other team events where you can as practice. Always be treating the WTC as your top priority. Show through actions rather than just words that you're committed to this team. And so that chat in the team, no one should be afraid, for example, of giving away their special singles tech in the WTC chat, because we all need to understand what that is for WTC. So there should be no obfuscation, no psychological warfare within the chat. It should be a congruent unit that's always working together and trying to come up with new ideas together. No secrets within the team. And that was something that Eric managed really, really well this year with the players who wanted to go play the singles event at the WTC as well. In that, even though we all worked together and had good lists, he set very, very clear and very robust boundaries, saying that, hey, this is some specific tech that you've got in your army. This is a very specific thing that we worked on together. Do not play that in singles. Even though my entire team understood my singles army inside and backwards, and we dissected it because we were competing against each other in the singles, the teams event is your priority and will always be your priority. And I expect the same thing from this year. Well, yeah, this year.
That's why we, for one, do not play singles, to not show our ideas as well. So you mentioned also that players were supposed to play the same army. So how do you guys approach choosing the armies? Do you anticipate the meta, find counters, or are you limited by what players can play, or how do you approach it?
So I wouldn't say we're limited because, the scene here is growing quite large, and we can always borrow, beg, and steal whatever we need to get the armies that are relevant. The main thing for me is I'm going to be approaching faction selection from like a tiered down approach. The top of that list is faction mastery. So, for example, let's say WTC was next week. The odds of me not playing Necrons are very low, seeing as I've played Necrons for the better part of a year. I won the singles, won the teams, high scoring at teams. I know what I'm doing on Necrons. And even though Necrons are more figured out than, for example, maybe like my Thousand Suns and Flamers army that's just sitting on the shelf, I would trust myself in a team environment much more with Necrons, because if I give a prediction, if I know what's happening with that faction. So when we have our 8 players, my first board and call is faction mastery. I don't mind if we don't have the exact 8 best factions statistically as ranked by a Warhammer community. What I care about is that the 8 players that we bring, if they tell me this is a 16-4, this is what I predict, that they are some of the best in the world, their faction, that they are so tried and practiced that that data matters. So that's the top thing for me. The other thing to mention is that the Aussie team has always kind of been this way, in the sense that you normally have maybe about half the team, let's say 4 players, who are, I would use the term soldiers, like they are very the expert at their faction, and they play only maybe a couple of factions, but damn, are they good at those couple of factions. And they're reasonably locked in about what they play. But the latter half of the team, the shields, for want of a better term, are a bit more flexible. And so, Typhus and Jeremy, they can sort of mix it up a little bit closer to the event potentially and adjust to what we need for the meta. And from the outgoing team, the people I put in that category, for example, are Eric and Jeremy Martino. They are people who can play harder games and conserve points better, for example, than somebody who just wants to go in and blow people up.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I guess, because you mentioned, the selection, the faction selections from starting from the top down, does that affect your team selection? Like, do you have a targeted goal of 4 shields and 4 of the others, or do you accept based on who you feel is the best fit for the team to evolve into that role?
The latter is the top priority. So I think that, especially as I mentioned, because it's such a big commitment, we do end up sometimes taking people who need to evolve and level up to get just that sort of level. But they're people who've committed early, both financially and time. And also we look at players' trajectory. We all know from our local scenes that you're going to have players who are really up and coming, who were doing well, then were doing great, and maybe could be legendary with a little bit of sort of, mentorship and guidance. So that's kind of what I look at there. Your earlier question was about, does player selection change faction selection? No. From an Australian perspective, I would say very much the factions are not the priority this far out from the event. Even more so for the 2023 event, because we're playing a new edition. Let's be realistic. If I was looking at factions now, I think I'd be a buffoon, because no offense to any other teams, but we don't even know what the rules are going to be, like the core rules of the game. You know what I mean? Like, so I feel like there's literally no point in saying that I reckon Craft Worlds are going to be amazing. Craft Worlds could be literally unplayable at the WTC.
Yeah. And you would have seen a similar thing if you had done the same thing in 2022, what with Nephilim dropping and upending the meta.
I mean, I've spoken about on some other podcasts. I was actually on my honeymoon when Nephilim dropped. Big thanks to my wife for letting me read all those rules while we were on a road trip. But I was playing Thousand Suns a week before Nephilim, and then I think the points dropped, and I was like, ooh, Necrons are looking pretty good. And then the missions dropped, and I was like, ooh, Necrons are looking really good. And then the data slate dropped, and I was like, mine. Like, I'm doing it. I'm going back. You can't stop me. And I expect July next year to be much the same. And so I would rather have a team of 8 championship team of 8 cohesive players who are going to then look at the new book with fresh eyes and go, this is what we need, rather than having, for argument's sake, a Craft World specialist who cannot play anything else and us being trapped by the fact that they're on the team.
That's a very good way of putting it. Typhus, I don't have anything else to say about that, but I do really appreciate that insight, because sometimes that is a question that comes up of like, do you prefer to have faction specialists? Do you prefer to have generalists? But as you said, you'd rather have a cohesive championship team than
And-
anything else.
Absolutely.
Coming back to like deadlines, when do you usually choose your team? Because it requires quite a lot of sacrifice and commitment. Like, do you set the deadline for like March, or when do you guys do it?
So there isn't a firm deadline, I suppose, in our charter. For me, the team will be selected very, very soon. And I say very, very soon. I expect by mid to end of January, we will have the team entirely selected. And then by early February, I expect to have the coaching squad also picked. I'm doing it so early because I think that for this event, upskilling and training and team cohesiveness is going to be more important than faction prep, because again, we're playing a new edition. So I would rather by the end of January us know that these are the 12 people who are going to be spending basically 100% of the time together for 10 days straight, and that this is the team who needs to hang out for barbecues and days that aren't 40k as well. Because when you're that tired and when it's 33 degrees in Belgium and you're that dehydrated, I guarantee you being mates is going to matter more than how well you know what Swift Strikes do.
Fair. Well, and now you mentioned also Nephilim. I think it kind of translates to 10th, but I'm curious, how did you guys handle it? Because like the shakeup was immense with how much changed and probably what you had prepared before the releases. It was all scrambled, or like mostly scrambled. So how did it impact, and how did you guys manage it?
So I've mentioned a couple of times faction mastery and sort of codex mastery. So even though I transitioned from Thousand Suns to Necrons, I have basically 3 or 4 factions that I've played since the beginning of time, and so I can kind of rotate between those. I've mentioned also the sort of the idea of shields and swords. So when Nephilim dropped and it became, manifestly evident that, the secondaries meant that certain armies were incredibly potent, by that point we had WTC terrain maps, everything like that. So when the Nephilim rules dropped, those people who I described as swords, as soldiers, they had more of a pick about what they wanted to play to do their role. For example, that's my own role in a team, in the sense that I was given a bit more leeway by Eric to pick a faction that he knew I could go into a matchup and say, this is a 19. Like, I know I can just get 100 points because I'm playing Necrons and they're absolutely silly season. And this is my role in the team. So those couple of people picked armies that they could do their job with. And then after that, the people who were shields got a bit more leeway in picking the factions that then they could do their job with, whatever they could do the best job with. So, for example, Eric has been a good GSC player for quite a long time, but additionally, GSC turned out to be perfect for Eric's role, the kind of not so much counter, but the reasonably poorly understood army that can go into a tough matchup and rely heavily on both player skill, but also he can play it a bit slow, see how the team's doing, push if he needs to push, but also take a step back and play safe if he knows we're going to win the round. It's extremely different to Necrons, where once the foot's on the pedal, you can't take the foot off the pedal. It's just getting 100 points. So to kind of summarize picking factions, it's codex mastery is Australia's top priority. I need to know that nobody's going to be, no Eldar player is going to be moved to Imperial Knights 2 weeks before list submission. That's just not going to happen. And then the second thing is codexes for roles. We're not going to put the player who's been playing Tau for a year straight and go get them to play GSC, because I think it's a completely different skill set, and I do not see moving people to a codex just because it's stronger when they have 5 years straight playing with a codex to be a reasonable way to approach it.
And actually, how many people apply to your team? Like, how many players you have access to choose from?
Yeah, so we opened applications. You could apply to be a player or a coach or both. So we kind of got I'd actually have to go back and count because we had people who would apply to both. So that there's quite a number of double ups to the application. So we got I think it was 82, 83 applications total, and from that, I would probably say about 50 people applied to be players, for example. Bearing in mind that I can't give you an exact number purely because like a lot of people applied to be player coach, like both, and just to see what they would get. I think it's really important to keep in mind that obviously that number, I would love it to be larger, but it is a huge commitment for the Aussies to go. But it's also about 5 times larger than it was for the 2022 team, because I think the championship win has done amazing things for team morale. It's also done really amazing things for how people perceive the team. I mean, I'm not sure if you guys have heard the term tall poppy syndrome before, and I don't want to. This is dangerous territory because I'm talking talking smack about my fellow Aussies.
Go for it.
Matt Morozoli could appear
Don't
out of
hesitate
nowhere
here.
and throw something at me. But one thing that Aussies culturally have always sort of struggled with is that the people who are the best at something, whether it's our politicians or our incredibly handsome 40K players, has always kind of been like people have always wanted to just do better than them, as in people have always wanted to level up to dethrone them. There's very much like a Highlander, King of the Hill style attitude where people just, though I'm sure there's respect there, people also want to dethrone the people at the top. But now that the WTC Australia team has actually won the event, there's this real grassroots bedrock support for the team because they're like, wow, these guys can win this championship. They can actually do it. So I have people who were your friendly garage hammer gamers who actually come up and go like, well done. Like I watched the stream, and well done. I watched the stream. Whereas previously, even after Serbia, you would have essentially random people who have never really played tournaments before who would say, I reckon I can do better than you. I don't reckon you're very good. And it's really been very wholesome and very awesome to see that this has kind of united the Aussie scene, and that's why we got so many applications. It is worth noting, though, that even though we set up a digital applications portal for people to literally apply to the event, I got Facebook messages, I got emails, and I actually got a written letter as well, which was incredible. It was a joke, to be fair. It was from a friend of mine, but I got a written letter with a very non-PG drawing in the letter. So that's Aussie humor in a nutshell, right? But anyway, so yeah, we got a lot of creative applications to the Aussie team.
Oh, that's great, but it's also terrifying for you because when you said that you're going to be very subjective and you need to analyze every player, now it means you have, 5 more players? Five times more.
Well, Typhus, for me, obviously, like I'm pretty busy with work, hence the fact that I'm, there now. But I have played a game against, or I have watched play a game every single person who's applied to be a player, and I have had a reasonable discussion with every single person who has applied to be a coach already. Absolutely no one has been left out of that list, unless, of course, they are literally deployed in the Middle East for the army right now, which is the case for one of our applicants. I obviously cannot play a 40K game with him at the moment. But I've put the time in. It is daunting. It was very daunting to start. I actually got a Google Maps of Australia and worked out what the most efficient pathway was for me to go and meet and talk with every single person. I had to do it by state. And when I've flown for
went face to face
with almost everyone. There were exceptions to that rule. I couldn't make it work. What I did was, for example, Perth, the western coast of Australia, is a 6.5 hour flight from where I live. I went over there for a team event, and when I was over there already, I took a day either side and I met with players, or I had chats with players, or I watched them play at the event. Like I specifically ended, like my games were over and I watched them play for like an hour and a half straight. So I have observed, I have watched, and I have spoken with every applicant for this team. This is not me. Like when I say it's subjective, this is the subject. Like I have looked at every person. I'm not relying on word of mouth. I'm trusting the fact that I understand the game and I know how people work. And so I've spent that time already to make sure that the subjectivity is as good as it can be.
Yeah, but it's still insane. Like that's
Yeah,
a lot of
that's
hours. Like
It
kudos
So-
to you.
it has been a distressing amount of time.
Yeah, like can imagine. Like you want it back to back very much. I can tell. So
that being said, it also means that you can place confidence in yourself knowing that you have selected the best and most cohesive team for your country. You haven't just gone and looked at, okay, here are the stats for the 50 applicants, and I'm just going to take the top 3 and work my way down from there.
Yeah. And I mean, it's probably not, an excellent example, but we have some players who I consider to be some of the best players in the entire world. Like, for example, Eric Latherus. And Eric played almost no events in the previous season for WTC, like in the 2022 season. For ITC, rankings-wise, Eric is not the top in the country. But I would steadfastly be a supporter of Eric, saying that I think he is still the best player I have ever played against or with. I am, I would definitely say that hand on heart. And I don't think that relying on rankings, especially in a country like Australia, where for you to even get ranked, for you to play 6 reasonable size events, you have to spend thousands of dollars a year to travel to events, and you have to have, the time, because I can't fly 6.5 hours on a weekend and go back to work on a Monday. Like, you know what I mean? For me to go to an event in Perth, like I mentioned before, that's a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then the Monday. So that's like 3 days of leave on top of the weekend. And that's assuming that, because we're in Australia, the airlines don't just randomly cancel your flights for literally no reason, and then you get stranded on what feels like the other side of the world. So yeah, it's a huge commitment. I can't rely on rankings because it's too inconsistent. You have to rely on the people who are going to be rolling the dice, the people who you're going to be spending 30 hours with at Singapore.
well, yeah, that's baffling. Like mind blowing to me that you had to you decided to spend so much time on all of this. You guys don't use TTS too much?
I've played a couple of TTS events, and we definitely do use TTS, but it's really unpopular here, for example. And I think it's unpopular primarily because, I don't know, for me personally, I don't like TTS, and I don't like TTS because I have a big pool of players around me, like where I live, and if I wanted a game, I could just like message, not the WTC chat, like my other hobby chat, the Normal Blokes. I could message the Normal Blokes, which has 30 dudes in it, and someone will be at my house playing a 40k game in an hour and a half. And so for me, physically spending time with a friend, chatting, maybe having a beer, is always going to be preferable to TTS. The thing that I've loved TTS for is bridging that distance between me and the people who are far away. So, for example, I have used TTS to play people in New South Wales and Victoria and Western Australia, but it will always be a little bit less preferable to meeting in person. And Typhus, one of the things, I guess, not to say that TTS isn't useful, because it is, for testing concepts and playing on terrain maps if you don't have the exact terrain that WTC does, because the specifications can change. And so it's important that we can sort of digitally mock up those maps. But the thing that TTS doesn't do is simulate 32-degree Belgian Neckarhall. It doesn't simulate looking across the table from someone who's one of the best players in the world. And it also doesn't simulate, the noise and the stress that a 40k event can actually put on you. And so when I go and play people, especially when I play people at events who have applied to the WTC team, maybe I do turn the screws a little bit. Maybe I do try and be a bit more rules as written rather than rules as intended. But it's actually very targeted. It's very goal directed, because at events, how people react to stress and how people actually deal with critical situations is hard, right? But on TTS, you can put yourself on mute, swear loudly at the screen, and they won't know that you've lost your cool. They won't know anything like that. And so for me, that's the element 40k that if we're going to travel that far, I need to know that people aren't going to break under pressure. Because, one of the things about this game, Jeremy, as well, is that, I'm in the Southern Hemisphere. You guys have more of an opportunity to play against people who are celebrities in the 40K world, the Sieglers and the Lennons and whatnot. And so when somebody is sitting across from, Siegler, for example, I want to make sure that they go, this is just another game. I've played a dozen of these games. I'm not going to break. Not being disrespectful, but having respect enough for yourself as a 40K player to not break under that strain. And that's something that I don't think TTS can teach.
I fully agree with you. I think getting starstruck or even losing your mind or cool, mind is a bad word. I don't think people lost mind too much, but like we're playing 40K pushing plastic soldiers, we might have, from what I know. But
I think the mental game is the word that you're thinking of.
yeah, like not being fluent in the language sometimes hurts me, but
No worries.
yeah, I think it's a huge thing that a lot of teams cannot handle, and it goes both ways because it's not only getting starstruck because you're playing against Sieglers of the world, etc. It's also about your own ego at times, because mental is also connected to your own expectations. And some people, when you talked about people who want to play those high scoring armies, in a team setup you might get into like the last 4 matchups and get a shitty pairing and then lose. So you need to make sure that those people will not crumble, because it's easy to get into your head thinking that your team didn't win because of you, and everyone can get into that state. You're muted, Liam. Still muted.
I think you might have a hardware mute on.
Hardware mute, yeah.
Is that better?
There you go.
Nice.
Way better.
So, honestly, I'm problematic today. I'm so sorry, guys.
No problem.
So, Typhus, you touched on something there that I think is super important with that sort of player attitude thing. If you take the 8 best players in a country to an event overseas, those 8 best players, I think you should always treat them as good as the 8 best players anywhere else. You should never think of yourself as better. And so the reality is, if you have the 8 best people from Poland playing the 8 best people in Australia, probably 4 of those people are going to lose. Now, those 4 players, if you've picked your best players in your country, none of those players are used to losing. None of those players are experienced losers at events. And so the psychology of teams, of that practice, and the reason we play so many team events is that even the best players in the country should celebrate an 11-9 loss. If those players go into an opponent's heavy scoring army and get an 11-9, that should be celebrated as a huge victory. For example, we had an event here called VTC, which I took a group of my friends, not necessarily WTC players, but a group there. And my Harlequins player, a guy called Brian Lakeland, got 1 point, 1-19 against Eric playing GSC. For Brian and our team, we thought that was an incredible victory. And we celebrated that. We bought him a beer. We were cheering. We were happy. We were excited. And I see that, even at the WTC, when people go down, even by a couple of points, they're not happy. And I think that psychology and that attitude is something that is so important to me, because otherwise you're going to get demoralized by round 2 out of 7 of the event. There's no way you can't go through the WTC and expect to win all of your games. That's not Teams 40K. That's not how it works. The other thing that's really weird is that when we're looking at like team composition, we use the term, I'm not sure if it's sort of, Typhus and Jeremy, I'm not sure if it's what you guys would use, but we use the term bussing a player. When somebody has bad matchups in a team, for example, we throw them under the bus a little bit to achieve a certain result. And you don't actually know who that player is going to be until you see.
We knew this year. It was me and Soli.
Look. But what I mean, sorry, is you don't know who that player is going to be until you see the lists that the other teams have brought. Like you submit your armies and you pick your team, blah 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 blah. But then when you get to reading the lists and you realize, yep, like for example, Drakari, not the greatest pick for the overall meta, didn't work out. Who fulfills what role then has to shift a little bit. And you might have someone who's used to tabling their opponent who is now someone who gets thrown under the bus. And if they can't handle that psychological shift, they're not fit to be on the team. That's the reality.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's one of these things where you would much rather have on your team someone who, once they start, if they end up being bust, gets you that 7 to 9 points every single game rather than scores you a couple 20s and 5 zeros.
100%. I think it's a weird psychological game that obviously all of us in this chat, like, we know this, but for players who are new and maybe applying to the team, it's weird to say that I would much rather all of your 20s drop to 16s than your 6s drop to 0s. Obviously, we know that's 2 points differential, but for some people, it's like psychologically hard to realize that losing at a less margin is sometimes way more important than pushing your wins already just a little bit higher. That's what wins a team's round.
And that's not something that's something that you get used to when you play win draw lose events. So you need a mentality shift to actually get into that and playing more team events. And touching upon the thing that you said about losing games, I think it's also important to play some team events, even like internationally, why we were playing those 8v8s on TTS. So players will actually get to lose.
100%.
And sometimes
yeah.
we'll make them
Yeah.
purposefully lose because we knew their estimation is off and they need to learn it. And that's why for WTC we had like few losing streak of screens, because that's the only way you will learn, boys.
Because if you lose as much as you like in practice, because when it comes to the real event, that's where the money is actually made. And your scrims, your 8v8 scrims, that's kind of, we do like a boot camp. And you mentioned when we started recording Typhus that the Aussies all fly a week before the event, and we have a pretty intense team building, but also just games over and over again, where, for example, our Tau player, Hayden Waldock, will put Greece's Tau army on the table, and we'll play Matt Jackson, who's playing Imperial Knights. And we go, Jackson, you should get 0 in this game. This is the hardest game possible. I'm not going to go practice the games that are good for us. We're going to practice the games that are the hardest for us. And Jackson, if you're going to get 0, let's make it so you get 2. That's your goal. You have to try and get 2 out of this. Play it once, he gets tabled in a turn. Done. Didn't work. Play it again, he gets 1 point. Play it again, he gets 3 points. And then we go, okay, we've learned things, we can adjust, we know what we're doing. Because Hayden is a world-class Tau player, I expect that he knows what he's doing with his faction, and Jackson now has a plan of attack to get those couple of points. And that boot camp is problem solving. That boot camp is where people get put waterboarded a little bit, and they play the hardest games humanly possible with the goals of getting a few points. For example, I didn't go to the boot camp with my 27 Scarab Necron army and play Blood Angels 5 times in a row, because that was a game that I know should be 19 or 20, regardless of if I get hit in the head by a flying Belgian whiskey beer. Because I've played that so many times, and I know that matchup's good for me. What I do want to play is Thousand Suns with Mortal Woundspan. What I do want to play is Tyranids, because it's normally quite hard on paper for some Necron armies. And that's how I spent the boot camp. And I don't expect that to change in future years. I think it was an incredibly productive way to approach it.
I think that's something that a lot of teams do, and it also touches on the mentality, because usually during the scrims, you play the bad matchups. You do not play the games you know you will win, like, I don't know, Sisters into Blood Angels, like those obvious matchups that are very straightforward. You play the games you are unsure of. And this is something we felt also at one time, like players who played during prep only bad matchups. And it can also get under your skin. Like, I remember someone complaining about it. So,
I mean, it can also, if you don't have the right attitude, it can also skew your data too. If somebody's played a lot of bad matchups, maybe their pairings data and what you're using as the pairings team, maybe it skews too far the other way, where the matchups are too conservative because they're used to losing. So, the psychology is really, really important. And obviously, I'm not saying that, my work helps with this, but I'm a psychiatrist, I guess, by trade. I work in mental health. I deal with anxiety. I deal with psychoanalysis quite a lot. And part of that is sort of me looking at personality structure and things like that to understand that people aren't telling me what I want to hear. They aren't trying to just appear to be more stable for argument's sake than they might be. It does help me a little bit in this sort of process because attitude is everything.
Yeah, I fully agree with all of this. And now that you've touched that you choose basically bad pairings for players or the pairings that they are unsure of, especially those newer ones. Like you need to make sure they are exposed to the experience and that they get those reps when they are thrown under the bus. Now, is there like something else that you decide what matchups players will need to play? Because you can do like mock pairings, or maybe you just, as soon as the lists are released, you might decide that here's 20 estimation tables, fill them in, mark what you are unsure about, and then we'll make sure that during those 10 days you guys meet, you will play all of those question marks that you have filled in. How do you guys do that?
So one of the advantages that I have is that Australia has a really incredible pairings team. It was Eric and Jeremy Martino and Matt Morozoli, and 2/3 of that team are returning with us in the coming year. I have not been as active as I will have to be more active in the coming year, but the pairings team was separate from me as an individual player. One thing I got as a player was I got a message saying, we've spent 10 hours straight looking at the Poland matchup, for example. And Liam, we think the chances are you will play Necrons, GSC, or this. And they give me like 2 or 3 options of, we think with 80% certainty that we can say you'll be playing one of these armies. Make sure your pairings are correct for those matchups. And I think to speak to the amount of time that people spent in and the commitment to this event, that happened for every single team. There were no teams that we did not do that for. And so when someone said to me, look at Team USA, we think you're probably going to play Tyranids 3 weeks before the event. And on the day, I played Tyranids. I have such faith in our pairings team that when I'm told to check certain matchups, I believe it. I believe it will probably happen in that sort of margin of error, so to speak. So that's kind of what we do. We lean very heavily on our pairings team because they've proven they can do it, and they are absolute galaxy brains, far smarter than I am.
And now with the preparation, did you guys like the idea of the pods and like the whole preparation for pods, or did you prefer without fucking 12 hours of gaming one day?
So look, I definitely do not like 3 rounds in a day. That was rough. That was really rough. And I think the roughest part about it was that when you leave the event at 10:30 p.m. and you go get a shitty kebab, and then you get back to your hotel at midnight, and you have to be up at like 6:30 a.m. the next morning, and the sun literally never goes down in Belgium. I don't know how you guys deal with it in Europe. It's absolutely crazy. It was rough for the Aussie. So yeah, look, 2 rounds a day maximum is reasonable.
But like the whole idea of having the teams in advance, how do you guys like it?
I as an individual don't like it, but if there is a vote on that, for example, I would prefer to like democratically ask the rest of the team like what they think and sort of come to a consensus. My personal opinion is that I don't like it, and I don't like it purely because I think that one of the challenges of this event that the Aussies rise to is prepping for every team and prepping for every team appropriately. And I kind of feel like the pod system by its very nature eliminates that challenge. And without being nasty, if there's a challenge that we can overcome, why would I want to make it easier for other people? I mean, like maybe that sounds a little bit toxic, and I apologize, but it's just kind of we've always put in the effort.
You can be as toxic as you want here. It's your safe space, man.
We've always put in the effort for every opponent, and I feel like the pods just make it easier.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. And I guess if you're putting in the work and you feel the other countries are not, it also means that your pod mates can prepare against you more particularly to offset you, to have you have a rougher start or even tailor to you.
And that's going to happen even more in
Hi, Belgium United. We see you.
and that's going to happen even more in 2023. Realistically, I mean, looking at the how the teams went, people are going to be spending more time preparing to play Australia. For me to assume that we can kind of slide underneath the radar anymore is probably not going to happen. And so, again, the pods probably only harm us. I mean, like, I don't feel like it helps us in any way.
Yeah. And especially if you're putting in the effort to prepare for all 27, 30 teams that are going to be in present, and an equal amount of preparation into all of those, do away with the pod system would benefit your team.
Yeah, I think the pods are a good solution for like lower teams, and by lower I do not mean to bash on them. I mean like teams that you wouldn't call a favorites to get into top 3, because they can also get exposure to actually play against those top teams, whilst normally they wouldn't, which I think is the biggest advantage of a pod. Because usually when I look at the pod, maybe there's in the remaining 3 teams we get in a pod, maybe we would play one of them.
That's fair. I mean, the flip side of that is that, for example, in this coming year, I'm really hoping that maybe even New Zealand can send a team. I hope we have that Greater Asia team that's been talked about quite a lot. There's a few teams that I really hope come to the event. But let's say, your little Billy, and you've just flown from New Zealand for 35 hours to come to the Northern Hemisphere for the first time in your life, and you've spent 6,000 New Zealand dollars, and you get to round 1 and you play Typhus, and you get blown up. I mean, the flip side of the pod is that you could, from the get-go, be playing a team that has drastically more resources at their disposal and drastically more experience at this event, and it could be immensely demoralizing for you to just go in regardless of where you're seated, etc., to play such a powerful team. The other problem is that if you are going to do a pod based on seed, you deliberately have this system where the higher seeded teams are potentially playing the lower seeded teams. And that, for a world championship, I personally disagree with, because I think that you probably should be, if you're smashing your opponents, you should be playing harder games from round 2 onwards, not round 4 onwards. That's kind of I feel like if you're developing a lead in a world championship, you shouldn't be able to do it round 1, 2, and 3. I think that's like you're getting too much momentum, for example.
Yeah, coming out of the pods 3-0 because your first round was hard and then your second and third rounds were cakewalks is a bit of an unfair advantage for, say a team that was seeded into as the medium part of their pod and come out 2-1 from that pod.
100%.
No, it's
especially when you get to like mid tables, you end up with a lot of tiebreakers where those different make a huge difference. Like in the top, it usually it changes a little bit, but usually it's still decided whether you won or lost against another top team. But whenever, if you are not in like top 5, I think like this year's top 5 was completely, when looking at the scores of the teams, I think it was completely fine.
Yeah, it was completely fine this year, and I think that one of the things that made it that way was that towards the middle of the event, like rounds 4, 5, 6, there were a lot of draws between various teams at the WTC. Probably more than we would like. For example, like we drew against USA and stuff like that. And I think that because of that, the win-loss bracket worked out in the end. But the worry that I have, which to be honest is not something the event organizers can fix, is that when we go and play 10th edition, which is going to be a completely different ballpark, who even knows if the 0 to 20 bracket is going to be reasonable in that sort of system? There is a world, for example, where scoring isn't out of 100 anymore. And then you have, we don't have any information, personally I don't, about what this new edition is going to be. And so the system and how we even approach this is going to be really fluid in July. And I do not envy our TOs, put it that way.
Yeah, but on the other hand, like when you look at the history of the scoring systems, we had different scoring system in fifth, sixth, and seventh edition, and also eighth and ninth. So like we kinda always figured out to make the differential work. Sometimes it was worse, sometimes it was better, I would say. But I think still it will be an issue that we will need to basically tell GW once again, your scoring system doesn't work. We need to implement our
We're doing
own.
our own thing. Shut up, GW. Yeah, no, I get it. I mean, I've only been playing since the end of 7th edition, so I didn't really see like 5th and 6th and what shenanigans happened there. Every now and then someone reminisces on Grey Knight side cannons or something, and I hear about it being crazy. But I've obviously played ITC events previously when they had the whole like hold one, hold more scoring, and you tick a box for each of those. So obviously I do know different formats can exist. I think the difference will be is how little time we have to get that right, realistically.
Yeah.
Because if the rulebook comes out at the end of June, etc., and we have a couple of weeks to read it, then Tom, Isaac, Neil have maybe about 4.5 minutes to come up with a reasonable scoring chart to approximate what is appropriate, and then the teams have about 5.5 minutes to write appropriate lists and come up with things. I tell you what, for me personally, as the captain, that boot camp that I told you guys about, I'm considering actually bringing it forwards to the release date of the rulebook and have everyone fly to Brisbane to spend 7 days straight making our wives mad, literally just working out what 40k is. Because I mean, let's be realistic, it's going to be a huge overhaul.
Yeah, and we know that there are going to be some teams that have an advantage with respect to that preparation that needs to be taken into consideration as well.
Well, guessing from
Nice
the
way to
scores
put
this
it.
year, they actually need it, so let them have it.
Oh, that's good. That's really good. No, I agree. There are going to be some discrepancies in the timing of rules coming out. Look, I'm just hoping that the Russian hackers really step their game up.
Yeah. No, that the idea of moving up that boot camp early is actually a very good one in that respect, and having your team mates and players aware of that commitment being necessary essentially is obviously a big part of making sure the team works this year. And it's something that we're going to have to acknowledge that we're dealing with every 3 years or so as GW continues to do this to us.
That's fair.
The new edition WTCs were always fun when it comes to how much shit we needed to figure out on a short note.
I don't know if we call 5 teams of Storm Ravens fun, but
oh my god. So I think one of the weird things about team selection in general is that like when I look at other countries, regardless, and the metrics that they use to pick teams, or even the multi-round team events that some teams play to just select one member of the team, I understand that, but I actually only understand that format if we're playing an edition I mean, for example, even though it's an achievement to win like a round robin teams event, and I understand that, I feel like that's approaching irrelevancy if you're playing a new edition with new codexes and potentially back to indexes all over again, because the tech and the knowledge that you bring to the table is secondary to your ability to adapt and your attitude to the game. So I feel like how the Aussies did it for 2022 is the most appropriate way to do it again. In fact, more so than it previously was, because everyone's going in blind. So picking that team based on players and team cohesiveness and attitude is just going to be, I can see no other way for us to actually pick a team.
And I would also say that with, for example, the newest changes dropping in like 1.5 weeks, I think we can all use that as a like sample and actually see how fast people can figure out stuff to actually get an idea of their cognitive performance. Let's say that.
You hit the nail on the head there, Typhus. So for example, in on the 21st, 22nd, I think it is, of January. Forgive me if I've got my date slightly wrong. It's the second last weekend of January. There's Uprising here in Australia, which is the biggest singles event we've got. 250-ish players, which for us is like the absolute biggest thing I've ever seen in my life. This is basically like Burning Man. It's the biggest, biggest 40K event I'll ever have been to in my home country. And this is not just our biggest singles event, but it's probably the last bit of data that I'm going to get before I pick the majority of the team. And we had a vote too about whether or not we wanted to use the new rules or not. And there were a lot of people, most people voted yes. I voted no. However, now that the vote has been decided and we are using the new rules, I'm actually really glad, because one thing I hadn't thought about beforehand, Typhus, but I now realize, is that even though it throws people off and even though it means the preparation you have done is going to be less important, it does mean that people have a week, maybe a week and a half, to fully adapt and fully change their attitude to their own factions and the meta. And that is a simulation for what we're going to be doing in August. It's actually a reasonable, it's even less time, but you're doing it for one person rather than an 8-man team. So to be honest, I actually think it's a really, really good test. And seeing how people adapt and also seeing how stressed people are about it is going to be really, really good for me to do some of that subjective analysis about how people approach it.
Especially when you said that you have like the team chat and you do not want people to hold anything and basically hide their ideas. Like, you can also see how this will work, like how well the data flows between the team members. So
it's a bit tough because we haven't selected the team yet, so that chat isn't what it will be. For example, there's only like a couple of people in that chat at the moment, but like for me, for example, for the people who have applied to the team, I'm straight up like my list for this event, I already know what I'm going to be playing. Like I've got this army to the side. I will tell people, hey guys, this is my army. I want to talk to you about your list, like from a Team Australia captain perspective. I want to hear what your thoughts are. I want to hear your analysis. And so, I'm not trying to get a one-up on people. People know what I'm going to be playing. I have nothing to prove from this event. I'm here to see how other people do. I'm here to see how they approach this new mission pack. So for me, this is actually going to be an even more valuable data mining expedition down in our Adelaide Uprising.
Nice. No, it sounds excellent. Yeah, I saw the vote for our Uprising, and there's vote. I was mentioning before we started recording that we have a local GT that's at the same timing as Adelaide, the 21st and 22nd, and they've voted to use everything. I've been talking with the TO for that, and it's similar, where it's just like, I'm going to be looking at, we have some prospects who are going to that event, and I'm going to see how quickly do you adapt.
100%.
So you're looking at your watch. Do you have an appointment coming up?
No. I've got about 20 minutes till my morning meeting, which is totally fine. The one thing I will say that is just a little bit funny is that if you are going to do a vote on Facebook for using new rules, my advice would be, don't use the like react for yes and the angry react for no. That is not good democracy. Not when, if you actually go and click on the Uprising Facebook event, you will notice that a number of angry reacts have been purchased. As in the bot Facebook accounts you can pay to troll votes, because there's like, there's 250 people going to the event and there's like 900 angry reacts, which is, and they're from names like, again, they're all
John Smith.
Yeah, they're all like clearly bot accounts, which is it's actually really, really funny to look at, because the poor TOs, they're doing their absolute best. They've had to go and match the votes to playlist, and they've had to go through and been like, is Rajesh Singh really an Australian 40k player? I've got to go and check. It's very funny, but also it just classic Australians trying to troll each other.
Yeah, I've got a Liam Hackett that voted no.
It's bad because I voted no, and then I changed my vote to yes. Except obviously I've got a different name on Facebook, and so it's just like, I'm pretty sure either way my vote is being counted as a troll vote, so I don't think it matters.
Okay, so as you said that you're getting closer to your morning meetings, which is still insane for me that we got a chance to talk about everything before you got to work. On like more closing notes, what would be one like singular advice you would give to new captains or people who are not familiar with the event itself?
Gee, that's a tough question. Probably my biggest piece of advice. I don't know how to say this like briefly, but don't spend a lot of time thinking that individual people on individual teams are going to sway the outcome of the entire event. And by that I mean, as a new captain coming from wherever, don't think that, for example, and again, I'm not in any way saying these people aren't exceptional 40k players, but don't in any way think that the Nick Nanavardis of the world are going to mean that USA will win the event. Don't think that that sort of celebrity power and the podcast energy is going to mean that certain teams actually have an advantage, because as we saw, in the last year, the team cohesiveness and the team is what is more important than any individual champions in a team. Championship team, not team of champions. And that goes for a lot of other teams who did extremely well, where I think they approached those celebrity players calmly and treated them just like another game. I will sing the praises from the hilltops for the Australian player, Simon G. I'm saying Simon G because I've never been able to pronounce his last name. It sounds roughly like Gotcha Dick. Gotcha Dick. Close enough. And, Simon can go play, Richard Ziegler and absolutely not even start sweating. He just treats him just like another person. And he won. Simon beat him. And I think that is something that, from my experience, players who do have celebrity status, I think, lean on quite a lot. And that's okay. You have your reputation to rely on. That's totally fine. But for a new captain, do not be daunted and do not think that that celebrity power always translates to game results, because it doesn't. It literally doesn't.
You can even look at the top three. Like, you guys were closest to being celebrities, and I don't think you were as popular before the win, even.
Yeah, no way, not at all.
You had singular events, like somebody getting top 8 at a tournament that they attended in US, but like you were pretty much not really known. Like
100%.
You were known in like podcast scene, but like us, nobody knew us outside of WTC, and same with Germany. Like maybe they knew Fred from Germany, and that's all.
And I think that one of the things that perhaps is really important is that, for example, if you went to the WTC and you spent 50% of your prep time specifically prepping for America, you would not be ready to win that event. You almost couldn't win the WTC if that's how you allocated your resources. So really, really very much my attitude is make sure you allocate your resources well and don't think that that celebrity power is everything. It matters, but you really should think of the teams as equals and use your time and everything accordingly.
But we need to mention that making sure that America is out of top 3 and England as well just saved us a lot of bragging on the internet. So thank God we've done that, guys.
I think that my ears are not bleeding as much knowing that the event went the way that it did. But also, Typhus, I would like to think that in future Poland will spend 50% of its time getting ready to play Team America. And same with Canada as well. I think that the more you guys prep for USA, the happier Australia will be. So I think you guys keep up that good work.
Oh, I've got a tab for Australia right now in our prep.
The little Excel tab where everything's green. It's like green matchup, everyone.
Yeah. On like final closing note, we at least got some banter in, so that's great. We weren't only
at the expense of a team that's not even here to defend itself.
Obviously,
it's Anthony's problem. This is his show, and he's not even here.
Yeah. Do you want to say something to your new prospects and your team? Some message, because I assume you'll share this video podcast to your team so they can listen to your thoughts.
The main thing I'm going to say going back is that as a returning team, I know obviously there's quite a bit on the shoulders of the team, but just like when you're playing an incredible opponent, just like you're playing a celebrity opponent, we are going back as a cohesive unit, and no individual result is going to decide a round. I will be making sure the team that travels has a good time, because at the end of the day, for many people, this is the holiday they get in a year. This is like their one overseas trip that they can do. And I want to make sure that it is an experience that nobody ever forgets. Because for me, Belgium 2022 was one of the best trips I have ever been on. And regardless of results, I want to make sure all of the applicants who end up coming with us have an awesome time. That's going to be one of my priorities too. I refuse to go over there and have the entire flight home be angry one way or another. We're going to have a good time. Those Primus beers are dangerous, but we will drink a number of those, and we're going to have a very, very good time.
Thank you very much for being with us at work, but not really at work. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
I was in the car for a little bit, and now I'm here.
Changing sceneries, making it interesting for us. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed hearing your approach and your own struggles and how you want to do it. And Jeremy, you want to do the plug?
All right. Yeah, I'm over here. We can never figure that out. So if you've been listening to us so far, I want to thank you for having taken the time to listen to us. If you're interested in checking out more of this, you can find the rest of our podcasts on any major podcast feed under Stat Check. If you are interested in watching this in a video format, I don't know why you would want to, but Typhus and Liam are pretty good looking right now. Feel free to check us out at youtube.com/statcheck. And if you really enjoy the work that we do and want to support us and encourage us to do more like this, we have a Patreon at patreon.com/statcheck. That is everything. Thank you, Liam. Thank you, Typhus. Have a wonderful day, Liam, and have a wonderful night, Typhus.
Thank you for staying up for me, guys.
No worries at all. My pleasure.